The traditional manger scene, which we are all used to seeing in our homes, perhaps, in front of the baptismal font, many other churches and some places, surprisingly, even in public space. That scene, the traditional manger scene of the child and the parents and the angels and all of them is based on the gospel that we just heard read from St. Luke. In it, we see Joseph and Mary, who had traveled from Nazareth to Bethlehem to be counted in an imposed government census. And because there was no room in the inn, a comfortable room, Jesus, we're told, was born in a stable, laid in a manger. And angels appear and shepherds come around from the fields, and there's this great celebration. We all know that story, and we find a certain peaceful comfort. It's a nice story, huh? Who cannot be moved with a baby in loving, adoring first-time parents and in all of the quiet that surrounds it. At Christmas in 2007, the Vatican did something that turned a lot of heads and raised a lot of questions. It had nothing to do with dogma. It had nothing to do with moral teachings. It wasn't really any particular news of shocking variety, and yet a lot of people were caught by what they did. It had to do with the Vatican replacing its traditional manger scene, which Luke described, with a radically new one. This new approach was inspired by the gospel according to St. Matthew. In Matthew's gospel, there is no report of Joseph and Mary traveling to Bethlehem. Joseph receives a message from an angel to take Mary as his wife. And Matthew says, he did as the angel of the Lord had commanded him and took his wife into his home. He had no relations with her until she bore a son, and he named him Jesus. This is Matthew's version that the Vatican had chosen that year in 2007 to be its Christmas scene. And so in the great plaza there at the Vatican, there was no stable with a donkey and an ox. There were no shepherds and sheep, and there was no baby in a manger. What you would have seen is a baby with his mother in Joseph's house. You would have seen Joseph's carpentry shop where he worked. Adjacent to that shop was a very small outdoor patio, and next door to that, there was even a pub in which people were depicted as drinking and celebrating around the fireplace. Now, hearing that, compared to what we're so traditionally used to seeing, you can just imagine how much conversation that caused. That was kind of like changing centuries of tradition. When asked about this, the Vatican official answered, he says, it was time for a change. I'm sure that was just a flippant remark because I think he had really a lot better reason for that. And the question then became, why was this move made from Luke's Gospels to Matthew's Gospel? Why move from a stable to a carpentry shop? I think one explanation that makes a lot of sense to me is that while the event is narrated by St. Luke is beautiful and peaceful, and we all love it, it's what we celebrate today in a world, but the reality is that we live in a world that is not so beautiful and peaceful. We would wish it were. We wish it was so tranquil as depicted in Luke, but we know our world is challenged with many difficulties. As exotic and romantic as it may be to picture Jesus surrounded by shepherds and sheep, serenaded by angels, it is more important to find Jesus where we live, where we work, and yes, at times, where we relax with friends. The Gospel of Matthew then challenges us to keep in mind that Jesus came into a messy world. He chose to be present to our world with all of its hustle and activity, with all of its good and bad, and with all of its hopes and disappointments. That is the real reality of what Jesus is born again into in our world today. Way back when I was a younger priest, I tried a little bit of Matthew also. We had a big crib scene, and we started it right at the beginning of Advent, but Jesus wasn't there, Mary and Joseph weren't there, but we had the animals and some things in the crib scene. And then at night I would come by and I would throw trash into it. I'd put candy wrappers and ice cream wrappers and bottles and different things. And people would come up to me, "Father, do you see what a mess in there?" Yeah. You know, and I'd keep doing that. And it got more messy, and finally a couple of ladies really got upset, and they came up to me and told me, "This is terrible, and we're going to clean it up." And I says, Good. That's the point I was trying to make, that as Christians, as followers of Jesus, we live in a messy world. And who's got to clean it up? We do. We have to begin to put into practice what Jesus was all about, and that Jesus came to help change this messy world, to bring light into a world where there's much darkness. And I think that was what the Vatican was trying to say too, that Jesus came into a world that he wasn't going to stay in a world where he could just be in a little crib, but he came into this world to bring light, to free us from sin, to enter into our world completely. And I think that's the great message of Christmas, is that Jesus came into this world because, first of all, he wanted to be one with us. He wanted us to know that he could stand in that messy world too, but he could make it better. And so Jesus always put people first. We must realize that there is nothing more important than the people that are sitting next to you now, the people that you will share celebrations with today and in the days to follow. Nothing is more important than the people in our lives. They are so much more important than the money we make, than the work that we do, than the comforts that we enjoy. There is no more important thing to do than to spend our time with our families, with those that we love, to share ourselves and our wisdom with them, to let them know that we love them and are thankful for them, for who they are and when they're with us. Jesus made people a priority in all of the gospel accounts. In his great commandment, remember what he said. He said, we are called to love God with all our heart and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And Jesus also wants us to be present to him in forgiving and helping to overcome the animosity that exists sometimes in our world and in our own families. Each one of us carries in our lives some kind of resentment, some anger towards someone who has hurt us or disappointed us. We have all the reasons why that person is at fault and why it is their responsibility to come and ask for forgiveness. But Jesus said, we must take the first step to forgive them. We must make the first step towards reconciliation. And we do that because it's simply God's way. When Jesus teaches us to pray, remember what he said, forgive us our trespasses, our sins, as we forgive those who sin against us. And finally, Jesus comes to be present to the weakest among us. Jesus calls us to care for the unborn, for the poor, for the sick, for the imprisoned, for those who are refugees, those who are struggling because of lack of employment. It is not enough for us to say, look, I'm taking care of my own life and my family. Let those people care for themselves. Jesus measures us against the way we care for the most vulnerable in our world, the most weak among us. He says, whatever you do to the least of my brothers and sisters, you do to me. As I said in my Christmas message to the parish, putting people first, forgiving, caring for the weakest among us, those are Jesus's priorities. If we are to be true followers and disciples of Jesus, they must be our priorities as well. Soon we're going to take down our beautiful decorations here in the church. We're going to put our Christmas music away at home. We're going to throw away our Christmas wrappings and unfortunately wait for our credit card bills to arrive. But the most important thing to do after Christmas is to keep the presence of Jesus with us by allowing Jesus to rule our hearts, to fill our hearts with love, forgiveness, and service to the least among us. As Matthew's gospel did, was to bring Jesus into that mess so that he could bring light. And so we're joyful for the Luke version, which is very peaceful. We need that. But it's also a challenge to us to bring Jesus where he can breathe the light that guides us during this new year that we soon begin. And to all of you, a Merry Christmas and a blessed and hopeful New Year.